The dust had settled on Margaret's face like the years had settled on her heart. She pulled the worn bonnet closer around her weathered features and tried to remember when she last felt truly alive. The wagon train had been moving west for 3 months now, and each mile seemed to take something away from her rather than bring her closer to anything that mattered. Her husband Thomas sat beside her holding the reins with hands that had grown calloused from more than just farm work. They had lost their youngest son to fever back in Missouri, and their oldest had gone off to war and never returned. Now at 57, Margaret felt like she was carrying the weight of all those empty spaces where love used to live. The Apache appeared at dawn like shadows becoming solid. Margaret had heard the stories about raids and violence, but when she looked into the face of the warrior who approached their wagon, she saw something different. His name was Joseph, though she would learn that later. What she noticed first were his eyes. They held the same kind of weariness she had been carrying. The same questions about whether life held any gentleness left. Thomas reached for his rifle, but Margaret placed her hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. The Apache warrior raised his hand in what might have been greeting or might have been surrender. Behind him other members of his band emerged from the morning mist, but they too seemed more tired than threatening. Margaret climbed down from the wagon despite Thomas calling her name. Her legs were stiff from sitting, but she walked toward the Apache man with something that felt like recognition. "Are you hungry?" she asked. The words came out before she had time to think about whether they made sense. The warrior studied her face for a long moment. Around them the wagon train had come to a complete stop, and she could feel the fear and tension from her fellow travelers. But something in this moment felt different from all the stories she had heard. The Apache man nodded once. Margaret walked back to her wagon and began pulling out supplies. Hardtack and dried meat and the last of the preserves she had been saving. Thomas watched her with confusion but did not try to stop her. She had been his wife for 32 years, and he knew that look in her eyes. It was the same expression she had worn when nursing their sick children. The same fierce gentleness that had drawn him to her all those years ago. Margaret spread a blanket on the ground between the wagons and the Apache band. She arranged the food carefully, the way she used to set the table for Sunday dinner when their boys were still home. The Apache warrior approached slowly. His people followed but kept their distance. Margaret sat down on one corner of the blanket and gestured for him to join her. For several minutes they sat in silence while the sun climbed higher and painted everything gold. Finally the Apache man reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small carved figure. A woman holding a child. "My grandmother made this," he said in English that carried the rhythm of another language beneath it. Margaret accepted the carving and turned it over in her palms. The wood was smooth from years of handling, and the expression on the woman's face was one of infinite tenderness. "She beautiful," Margaret said. The Apache man smiled for the first time. "She told me that when the world becomes hard we must remember what it means to hold something precious." Margaret felt tears starting to blur her vision. She had not cried since they buried their youngest, but suddenly all the grief she had been carrying seemed to demand recognition. "I lost my boys," she whispered. "Both of them." The Apache warrior nodded slowly. "I lost my daughter," he said. "The soldiers came to our village last winter." They sat together in the growing warmth of the morning sun. Two people who had learned that loss was a language everyone spoke. Around them the wagon train waited and the Apache band waited, but Margaret and Joseph existed in their own small circle of understanding. "Am I still human?" Margaret asked suddenly. The words surprised her. She had not meant to voice the question that had been haunting her for months. The question that came to her in the dark hours before dawn, when grief felt like it might consume everything that remained of who she used to be. The Apache warrior looked at her with eyes that held depths she recognized. He reached out and took her hands in his. His palms were warm and rough and completely familiar. "Yes," he said simply. That single word fell into the space between them like water into dry earth. Margaret felt something inside her chest begin to loosen. Something that had been held too tight for too long. "Yes," he repeated. "The heart that can still break is the heart that proves we remain human." They shared the food Margaret had brought. The Apache warrior called to his people and they approached slowly. Margaret watched as they sat in a circle, and she saw in their faces the same mixture of hope and sorrow she had been carrying. Thomas eventually joined them. Then others from the wagon train. By midday they were sharing stories and Margaret found herself laughing for the first time in months. The Apache children reminded her of her own boys. The way they watched everything with wide curious eyes. The way they leaned against their parents when they grew tired. When it came time to part ways, the Apache warrior pressed the small carving into Margaret's hands. "Keep this," he said. "Remember what my grandmother taught me." Margaret reached into her own belongings and found the silver locket she had worn since her wedding day. Inside was a tiny photograph of her and Thomas from their early years together. She handed it to the Apache man. "Remember that love leaves echoes," she said. The two groups went their separate ways, but something fundamental had shifted. That evening as the wagon train made camp, Margaret sat beside the fire holding the carved figure. Thomas settled beside her. "You did something important today," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. She had remembered something she thought she had lost forever. The knowledge that kindness was not a luxury but a necessity. That the human heart was designed to recognize itself in others. That even in the midst of great loss the capacity for connection remained. Over the following weeks as they continued west, Margaret found herself changed. She spoke to other travelers who carried their own griefs. She listened to stories of children left behind and parents who had died and dreams that had been buried along the trail. She began to understand that suffering was not something that separated people but something that could unite them if they had the courage to be honest about it. The carved figure became a talisman. When the nights were long and the way seemed impossible, Margaret would hold it and remember the Apache warrior's single word. Yes. Yes to the question of whether she remained human despite her losses. Yes to the possibility that kindness could survive in the hardest places. Yes to the truth that love once given never truly disappears but transforms into something that can be shared again. Months later, when they finally reached their destination in California, Margaret placed the carving on the mantle of their new home. Visitors would sometimes ask about it and Margaret would tell them the story. About the morning when kindness appeared in the desert. About an Apache warrior who understood that humanity was not measured by happiness but by the willingness to keep one's heart open even after it had been broken. About the word that changed everything. Yes, she would tell them that she learned something important that day. That we are most human not when we are strong but when we choose gentleness in the face of our own pain. That kindness is not about fixing anything but about recognizing the sacred worth in another person's struggle. That sometimes the most profound conversations happen between strangers who meet at exactly the moment when they both need to remember what it means to be alive. Margaret lived to be 86 years old. She never forgot the Apache warrior or his single word of affirmation. In her final years, when people came to her for wisdom, she would tell them about that morning in the desert. She would say that the secret to surviving loss was not to become hard but to become more tender. More willing to see the humanity in unexpected places. More ready to offer what you have even when it feels like you have nothing left to give. The carved figure passed to her daughter-in-law and then to her granddaughter. Each generation learned the story. Each understood that they carried within them the capacity for the kind of kindness that recognizes no boundaries. The kind that sees through differences to the universal need for recognition and care. The kind that answers the deepest questions with the simplest truths. Yes, we are still human. Yes, we are still worthy of love. Yes, we still have something to give.